just recently we had Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU, or at least the commissioner, the person, the big cheese in charge of the EU at the moment, come out and say that, look, we can see plainly that the UK will be going back on Brexit. And she's not the only non-UK voice saying that. If you ignore for the moment everyone from the UK and what they've got to say on the subject, but if you purely look at EU voices, she's not the only one saying this. There have been other very high-profile people in the EU come out and say this, from former, European presidents, Angela Merkel. I believe I think it was the Dutch former prime minister said about this, that it wouldn't be surprised if he would see the UK back. We've had, of course, some very, very prominent EU politicians. I can't remember the name. I can see his face with the glasses. He even said, Brexit will probably end up being reversed because it was built on a house of lies. And as we've said before, you can only really keep the momentum that leaving the EU was a good thing so long as you can keep that going, that lie going. And we have seen that now. You've had Boris Johnson gone, you've had Brexiteer after Brexiteer after Brexiteer being brought, essentially from the wilderness in many cases to the sort of the front bench to perform their roles. Well, what happened to them? Each and every single one has time and time again failed. Even someone like Liz Truss, who campaigned to remain at the time and then flipped into a hardcore Brexiteer, ultimately failed and has now been dispatched back to that political wilderness again. Jacob Rees-Mogg, for example, is another classic example, brought to the front benches to be the minister in charge of Brexit opportunities. Very briefly, of course, the business, the minister in charge for business, not trade, because that's still a separate department at the time. But very short-lived, of course, part of the Liz Truss administration, banished to the backbenches. Very, very rarely do we actually now hear anything almost from many of these once highly prominent Brexiteers. So I do have to generally ask the question, is Ursula von der Leyen actually right in this? And I'm not the only one asking that in the response to this, because there were a lot of people saying, well, it's really strange that you have someone as high profile as Ursula von der Leyen saying this is going to get reversed. Britain is slowly, coming back in its way. Normally there would be a massive outcry. Not even Marc Francois seemed to have responded to this. I think the only real one was, Lee Anderson, who came out and said, well, if Brexit ever gets reversed, he'd move to Orkney, which even then I think is still far too close for my liking. But there you go. He'd said he would sort of move to Orkney, and that's it. That's their grand response. That's their magnum opus. Not even Daniel Hannan bothered to respond, of course, to this either. And yet, you look at the realities of this, the things that were promised during Brexit, the idea we would be, first of all, we'll become this magnificent trading nation. Well, no, we are a prisoner of geography. We are a European country sitting at the doorstep of Europe. We can't just decide we're going to join, the Pacific Partnership or the CTPP and say, oh, this is great. Look how fast and growing this area is. But trade doesn't work that way, as we've discussed many, many times. Why? Those are developing economies. Their line is, of course, if you look at the chart, it's going up like that. But eventually, just like every single developing economy, once they have developed their economy, that line will start to flatten. It will start to curve. Are we then expected, as I said, what happens if that area, that trade block, starts to flatline? Do we go and join a new trade block? Because that's clearly the other one. Not only that, but some of the rules and regulations in, of course, the Pacific Partnership, if they were part of the EU, the Brexiteers would be absolutely balking at how dare the EU be allowed to do this. And yet not a peep, not a single peep comes from the Brexiteers when we hear about numerous things that is involved in us joining the CPP, namely, of course, that is not this is the single market. Everyone agrees to this is the level and no lower than that. Where the Pacific Partnership is, we might be up here, Malaysia's like here, they're still allowed to export stuff to us, even though it's a lower standard. Animal welfare is another classic recent example. What advances have we made in animal welfare since Brexit? We haven't really made any great advances. Look at the water quality. Now that we're no longer part of the EU, water companies no longer have to fear being fined by the EU. And we have seen a dramatic rise in river pollution as well as sea pollution as well. And by the way, how long before the EU reacts to that pollution of the sea? It's only a matter of time before they go, hey, UK, all this, pollution you're dumping out into the sea because, we can see it. Stop or else, because they will do something eventually. And there are numerous other things that have happened as well. All the promises, the NHS, it would all be sort of sunshine and rainbows and how wonderful it would be. Well, all those have now crumbled away. The Brexiteers have disappeared and dissipated. And as I've said, next Parliament, we can already see it. We're going to have probably a more pro EU Parliament and be able to actually have sensible discussions, because anytime, certainly within the past 2, 3, or 4 years, if you tried to have a sensible discussion, in the House of Commons about Brexit or its impact, it shall we say, wouldn't be that sensible discussion. And many times I've said this before about the House of Lords. As much as I want to sort of see it gone and banished and reformed into sort of something far more democratic, I'm at least glad that we have had it for the past couple of years, because it has been the only place where Brexit has been sensibly discussed and talked about. But of course, you've got people like, Liam Fox in the House of Lords now, touting how wonderful leaving the EU is, and yet constantly gets torn down by pro EU lords constantly. It's honestly kind of funny if you see those clips. But something I want to talk about today, and this was Will Hilton brought this up as well. So he brought it up in his piece, and I just want to go over this because I think this is right. There's people talk about, well, what about rejoining? What about the vote that would eventually happen? And he brings up a fair point I think it's worth talking about. So this is what he brought up. So, but rejoining. Pro-EU sentiment is certainly hardening. The European movement is its largest that it has ever been. That is certainly true. That is very true. In Greater London, there is a strong support, especially amongst the young. There's not just the young in London, it's the young everywhere. A lot of people have realised just how that that freedom of movement to sort of go, live and work has been taken away from them. What you would get is young people, they would grow up, they would see these opportunities elsewhere in Europe. They could go, maybe work there for a couple of years, still have sort of good ties that they could just, nip back across, to see their family. No, that's now gone. So a lot of young people do see that advantage now from them sort of taken away. The Labour Party are overwhelmingly in favour. That's very true. Something, as we just talked about yesterday, when it was, Corbyn o'clock. Corbyn ignored the fact that that his own party was overwhelmingly in favour of the EU, and yet people love to talk about, oh, but Keir Starmer's ignoring, the Labour Party on this. Well, what about Corbyn when he ignored the pro-EU sentiment in Labour? You don't hear that a lot. But anyway, we've already done that video. Rejoining would also mean faster growth in living standards, better security, and paradoxically, lower immigration. A story that works both well in the Red Wall and urban seats in Britain. And it would divide the right into the Faragists and the realists, thus marginalizing it. And that's what I would say would also happen as well. I think that would happen as well. That any vote to rejoin, you would get the realists who are like, well, leaving has not worked out very well. You made all these promises. Those promises have not come true. Of course, the Faragists will say, well, this is just a Brexit betrayal. You don't understand. Brexit wasn't done right. Of course, this will be the new cry. Of course, just like, you hear the communists saying, well, communism wasn't done right here, etc., etc. And they'll talk about it for the rest of time about, Brexit betrayal, but of course, eventually it will die down. We've done it, we've tried it, it failed. You can't really, sell it again when it was, quote, a disaster the first time, and of course that's what will end up happening. The Faragists will, in some way, I'm sure, have somewhat of a small block. They always will do. But that's the reality. I think the realists on the right will realize that, actually rejoining the EU will improve living standards. It will improve a whole heap of things when it comes to it. And I think that's what is going to be the ultimate driving force back. The idea that, Leave ran on these incredible promises that it was going to deliver, sunshine and rainbows. And of course, well, it didn't deliver, sunshine and rainbows. It ultimately failed and was built on lies. And as we said numerous times, this entire project was built on lies. And eventually, those lies will just not stand up to scrutiny, no matter how much you try to repeat them. And we saw this, as we said at the beginning, with Ursula von der Leyen come out and say, "Hey, you're going to be going back on Brexit. We'll see you back in the EU soon." Normally, the Brexiteers would have been shouting from the rooftops their opposition to this. Well, they were absolutely nowhere. And of course, Farage is, technically in the jungle, so I suppose he can't respond. But there are other prominent Brexiteers. No one really said anything. And that says everything I think you want to know, that they just don't want to talk about Brexit anymore because even they know just how badly it has gone. So ultimately, I think Ursula von der Leyen is right. We will be going back on Brexit, and I think it starts really in the next parliament. Because you're going to get Keir Starmer, you've got David Lammy being sort of very realists about this. Maybe we end up back in the customs union. Maybe we end up signing some, agreement deals on like veterinary sort of standards and practices, which sort of help at some point to alleviate some of the stresses we're seeing at the border. Again, I don't think the EU would specifically say no to signing those deals, but like I say, we'll have to wait and see. And eventually, I think we will eventually go back. I know people have talked about 2040, maybe as soon as that, this is being back in the EU, but could happen. It could happen very, very quickly and a lot quicker than people sometimes think. Like I say, sometimes things like this just happen very quickly and a lot quicker than people think. But it could indeed happen very quickly. So As always, let me know what you think down below. What do you think to Ursula von der Leyen's comments? What do you think to the silence, of course, more interestingly, of course, of the Brexiteers? I think that's more sort of interesting itself. I was going to call this video "The Silence of the Brexiteers," and maybe do sort of a "Silence of the Lambs" parody, but maybe another time. you know, you talk about Brexit, or it gets the hose again. But of course, as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, please remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button on your way out. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.